You told me in Denver that during the time you were gathering information as a whistleblower, you were having to arrange furtive meetings, for example, in a park. I was listening to you describe this, and it made me think of the Moscow rules that CIA agents had to learn for clandestine service during the Cold War. I'm just going to recap those rules for you so you can see if this sounds familiar. You cannot assume anything. You have to trust your instincts. You should assume everyone you meet is under enemy control. Assume that you are being tracked and followed at all times. So blend in, be seen to go with the flow, lull the enemy into complacency. Don't antagonize the enemy. Stay flexible, vary your patterns, and create a moment when you are free to act. That's essentially how the Moscow rules work. Does any of that sound familiar to you?
Uh, wow. Yes, I think I've been essentially living within those for the last 2 years.
My guest today is Jamie Reed. She blew the whistle on the Washington University Transgender Center in St. Louis, rushing hundreds of minor children into the gender medicalization regimen, including children who had no business being asked to give informed consent. Reed has become a tireless advocate for state laws banning pediatric transition. In fact, having seen her in action, the word warrior comes to mind. Jamie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Matt, for that really nice introduction too.
You recently tweeted, every time a gender clinic closes, it becomes clear that I was not only right, but that I was once very, very, very wrong. When you took the job, you thought you were helping the kids. It turned out that you were helping to do something that did not help the kids. Why did you buy in to the pediatric transition myth at first? Because most people did to some degree. I'm not singling you out. I'm asking what blinded you specifically, because other people were blind too, plenty of people. I, for one, did not get at first what was happening. Even though I did see it earlier, I still had to see through it all. So why couldn't you see through it before you did?
I held a lot of institutional trust. So I had worked for a long time in HIV case management. And HIV care is and was a field that had to be so firmly grounded in science and evidence. So when HIV case management really came into its own, part of the real detail of that job was that I was well versed in the mechanics of HIV and how it was contracted or how you could keep yourself safe from it, and then also all of the generations of HIV drugs. And so, one of the things that trans did in some ways really well that I have even heard Joanna Olson Kennedy talk a little bit about on the New York Times podcast called The Protocol was she did talk about how a lot of trans care grew out of HIV care here in the US. And so for some part of me, I found that the HIV care model was so firmly grounded in the realities of the science of this virus and its transmission that I had this kind of institutional or just belief that one was flowing out of the other. And I remember still working in HIV care when I first read the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, when I first read a WPATH standard of care. And when I read SOC 7 for the first time, I remember thinking, well, this is a, relatively clear protocol. It covered a lot of the general kind of groundwork for how this care model could be carried out, and I had trust in it because WPATH for me flowed out of these other care protocols that I just had this belief in it because of how it was first introduced to me. But I do know plenty of people who immediately were very skeptical of this care model. Even my spouse at the time thought that this was kind of suspect and didn't really get why it was being introduced to kids. There was just one other element that I bought into, which is in a lot of pediatric care, especially mental health pediatric care, the concept of early intervention is really pushed as something that's really helpful. So you think autism, early intervention, the earlier you can diagnose, the better the outcome. There's so many elements in pediatrics where you think that it makes sense that an early intervention leads to better long-term outcomes. And I also kind of believed that to be true in trans also, that the earlier you intervene, the better the long term. And so there was this confluence of things that led me to become a real true believer, that led me directly from HIV case management into trans case management.
When you blew the whistle at the Free Press in February 2023, I said at that moment, and you can find at the Distance Mag, that it was the beginning of the end. That once we had a whistleblower, there would be other whistleblowers, and that would be the beginning of the end. And you said back then that kids were identifying as mushroom, rock, helicopter. And you were called a liar and you were smeared 6 ways from Sunday, but it turned out that all of your claims were substantiated. Jesse Singal, he gets flack and some of it he deserves, but on this particular story, he was a star. So I'm not going to ask you to repeat the whole story.
Okay.
But for the audience who might not be familiar with the amazing details of your story and what you saw, can you just tell us what it was that caused you to say, this is too much for me to contain? What is the peak trans story? How much was too much?
Oh, that's a really tough question because I stayed there for so long. I I had so many moments where I felt like, okay, there's no way that this could go any more off the rails. And then another patient, and it was just case after case after case. And in so many ways, I feel like I spent probably the second half of my tenure there beating my head against the wall, um, not being able to understand how it could get any crazier, and then it would just get crazier. Um, there was this interesting kind of peak moment that actually didn't really happen for me, but I was privy to it because I was a trainer. So the clinical nurse coordinator and I did a lot of trainings, like a Trans 101 training to the other medical divisions within this giant hospital setting. And one of the training series that we did was with all of the emergency room staff. And so this would be the EMTs, the frontline RNs, the clinical nurse coordinators, the nurses, the techs, a lot of the frontline emergency room staff. And we had done this training I don't I don't remember the years right off the bat, but it would have been in my first year or two of tenure. And I remember doing this series of training. There's so many emergency room staff, so you do the training like 6 or 7 times over the course of 2 weeks. And all of the staff was curious and they were really engaged and there was really no pushback. And the first time we did this, they were in learning mode and they wanted to understand this patient population and they were open. And then the nurse and I did it again towards the end of my tenure. And what had changed in that interim? Oh, it was like the world had met trans and come to the realization this is all wrong. And these are really smart, well-educated, really caring clinical staff. To work in an emergency room, you have to really put so much of yourself, like, second to be an emergency room worker. And these workers came in this second training and they had been experiencing this is a pediatric hospital. They had been experiencing a few years now of pediatric trans identified patients, and they were ready for somebody to do something. Um, you mentioned the children with the really bizarre pronouns. So pronouns like it, rock, mushroom. And that came up in those trainings. The emergency room staff was saying like they were no longer in open teach us mode. They were in what the hell are you all doing? These kids are not well. And we had emergency room staff informing us that they were seeing every single shift a new trans identified young person who were often coming um, in serious distress, not being well cared for, many on hormones with no mental health follow-up. And they were just aghast at what we were doing. And there was a series of emails that the nurse and I wrote after that second set of trainings where we basically called out and told all of the people above us, like, this is really starting to fall apart. And the internal fights that we had been having for years, all of the internal um, distress and all of the patients, I feel like that was when it had really spilled over and there was really no hiding it anymore. Like, we clearly were, we clearly were running a very broken um, system, and there was no way we could keep it under wraps anymore. The rest of the hospital system knew. And I think for me, that was one of those moments where I definitely felt kind of empowered by these other clinical minds because it was no longer just the nurse and I going, this is batshit crazy, but basically, when you have all of this other clinical staff seconding the problems, I think that was part of when it really tipped for me.
One of the most disturbing things about the pediatric transition fad is how it disproportionately impacts gay kids. You call them proto-gay. It's a contentious area because there are always some adults who get very upset at any acknowledgement that minor children will develop a sexuality in adolescence. And there is this nature versus nurture argument even among gay people. The point is that whatever we call them, these are kids that would almost certainly or very likely be same-sex attracted adults if they were left alone to go through puberty. And I'm sure you have experienced the intense level of gaslighting and denial that exists around this issue from advocates of transgender children. So, do Democrats ever get it when you tell them this? Does it impact them, even if they don't vote our way? Do you ever get the sense that they are having a second thought about cheering on the child sterilizing cult that systematically targets gay kids? Or is it still full blown denial out there?
Oh, this is a really good question. What we are seeing on the ground is that there is a subset of Democrats who do get it. And I I find it challenging to paint that subset of Democrats with a broad stroke, but when we narrow it down, what we're seeing is that there are oftentimes in a lot of these states either African American, Hispanic, um, or also first gen immigrant communities or elected leaders who get it, and they get it in ways that we are not seeing your traditional white elected Democrats understand it. And so there's a couple things that I think you can pull out of those elected officials that I think is really telling and important. So, one of the elements that we see with some of the African American, Hispanic um, elected officials who are Democrats is that they always had, I believe, a little bit more skepticism or belief in the institutional structures always serving them well. So they, when I have talked to some of the African American Democrats, things like Tuskegee come up, or the lack of just belief that an institution can go wrong. Like they have this gut level understanding that institutions can seriously have things go wrong, and they know that. Um, the other demographic in the elected officials that I'm finding really interesting with the Democrats is age. So a lot of people know the name Jonah Wheeler, who is a really amazing young African American, biracial, uh, elected Democrat in the state of New Hampshire. The thing that has really stuck out for me about Jonah Wheeler is actually his age cohort. So he is the youngest elected Democrat. He was elected at 19. And one of the things that Jonah has experienced that your traditional middle-aged, Gavin Newsom's have not is that he came of age in this era of trans. So he was elected at 19. He saw his peers highly influenced by transition. And then he saw what so many of us in the gay and lesbian community have seen, which is that these people are not doing well. He saw them all take on this identity, claim that they were living their best life, everything was great, but then he also has that direct peer experience to see and know they're not doing well. They're not getting jobs or moving forward or really going through the steps of maturing into adulthood. And so, for the most part, unfortunately, I think the huge broad stroke of the Democrats is they don't get it. They're not seeing this as gay conversion 2.0. They don't understand what they're supporting. But the small subgroup of Democrats that do understand it in a fundamentally important way that still gives me some hope for the party still to move on this issue. I have not given up on the Dems completely yet.
We actually do need two working political parties in order to remain a republic.
Yes, we
Um,
do.
in your public comments, you also talk about the way this phenomenon has swept up new populations in each country. The Dutch experiment used gay kids. The Tavistock Clinic in the UK swept up new populations. And here in the United States, what are these newly included target populations for pediatric gender ideation and medicalization? What different kinds of kids have been stuffed together under the trans kids umbrella that might have been left alone before?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And so, one of the things that we try to always reiterate is first of all, we completely understand that so many of the kids who are swept up now are not your prototypical proto gay and lesbian kids who, when it spilled out of the Dutch into Tavi and then across into Gems and spread from there is what it really started picking at is these populations that we usually use the word vulnerable to describe, but what I do think it's important to understand that these vulnerabilities are really wide ranging. So it started to pick off the kids who had particularly high functioning autism. So the initial kind of subset of the autistic kids would have originally been probably called the Asperger's kids. I think we see a lot of the boys have that as one of the through lines. So we see that they're picking off the autistic kids. Then the other cohort that we saw high numbers of is that there were girls with ADHD diagnoses. That is an interesting group. ADHD diagnoses are primarily given to boys. So there was something about that vulnerability of these girls who had an ADHD diagnosis. It starts spiraling out from there. So then we get the kids with trauma, usually sexual assault or sexual abuse histories. We see the kids who are in foster care or out of home care. Um, there's a couple other really, just from an anthropological perspective, I think really interesting subgroups. So first generation kids, so kids who have an immigrant parent, sometimes both parents are immigrants, sometimes one parent is an immigrant. We see higher numbers of these first gen kids. Part of, probably the hypothesis around there is this, they're seeking inclusion into some element of a community. They're seeking the feeling of acceptance. And so something that they feel the rejection of being sometimes, the primary English speaker in the home, or kids who come from immigrant communities, Southeast Asian, Pakistan. We saw higher numbers of these cohorts in clinical settings. And then kind of the last subgroups that trans is now picking at, you think just any of the cohort of kid that was like not the cool kid in your high school. The really gifted kids, I've seen really gifted kids who you would think that their high IQs would be some kind of a protective factor against this. It hasn't worked out in that way. They are brought in. And then something that rarely gets talked about because it's hard to talk about in a compassionate way, but I did see a very small number of kids who were already in their late teens in locked down facilities. Young, these would be 16, 17-year-old, primarily boys who were already being held for some kind of sex offense. We saw a few of those kids as well being brought over to the center. I don't ever want people to think that I'm trying to claim that, trans, kids who identify as trans all have sexual perversions. But I do recognize that we did have those kids were somehow already being brought into a pediatric center, which I found completely not the pathway that they should have been on, a medicalization pathway. Oh, and then sorry, one other interesting cohort is the young people with somatization disorders. So kids who were picking up other illnesses. You will see the high numbers of kids who believe that they have tick disorders. We see a huge carryover with the kids who are being diagnosed with POTS, and also Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So they are getting these are other catch-all diagnoses where basically you have people who are complaining of some kind of physical distress. Often you cannot give them a true biological diagnosis, so they're being given these other diagnoses, and you're seeing trans catch those kids as well.
I think it's important that we talk about the climate of fear in the clinics and the hospital systems where this has been going on, because there will be a lot of denial in the years to come. I went walking with Billboard Chris outside Vanderbilt Children's Hospital in November 2022, and a woman in scrubs who saw us coming turned towards us so that she could walk past and whisper thank you at a safe distance from anybody's hearing. You told me in Denver that during the time you were gathering information as a whistleblower, you were having to arrange furtive meetings, for example, in a park. I was listening to you describe this, and it made me think of the Moscow rules that CIA agents had to learn for clandestine service during the Cold War. I'm just going to recap those rules for you so you can see if this sounds familiar. You cannot assume anything. You have to trust your instincts. You should assume everyone you meet is under enemy control. Assume that you are being tracked and followed at all times. So blend in, be seen to go with the flow, lull the enemy into complacency. Don't antagonize the enemy. Stay flexible, vary your patterns, and create a moment when you are free to act. That's essentially how the Moscow rules work. Does any of that sound familiar to you?
Uh, wow. Yes, I think I've been essentially living within those for the last 2 years. Uh, yeah. Um, so one of the interesting things as a whistleblower is that I do think you become sort of a beacon for others who are testing out the waters, considering their own, position if they want to follow a similar path. And I will say that I've met with so many people who the public has never heard of because they have made the decision to not go public. Because being a whistleblower, there's a couple things that are probably pretty much guaranteed. You're probably going to lose not only your job, but your career. You're probably not going to be hireable in pretty much any uh, adjacent field ever again. Um, a lot of whistleblowers will never work meaningfully in any way again. And, to be frank, the whistleblowers that had come out of Boeing, I believe two of them are no longer with us. So, yeah, I started living within these kind of Moscow rules. Oftentimes, what would happen is a potential whistleblower would reach out, make contact, and then it just becomes this tiptoe like dance for a long time. You assume that they're a plant, you assume that they're an enemy, you assume that they're trying to get in. You tell people, I mean, you essentially like it almost becomes a card game where, you will only lay down a card if they put some skin in the teeth and lay down a card. And one of the things that I did find myself, starting to do was tell people things like, "Hey, let's go for a walk. I'll meet you in a park. We can go for a walk and we'll both, agree we'll park in the same, place and we'll both watch each other lock our phones in our car." Um, trying to give each other the sense that, "Hey, I'm not recording this." Um, and I trust that, "Hey, I'm locking my phone up. I'm hoping you're not recording too." Um, those kind of those kind of things. And then um, it takes a really long time to build up a relationship. to the point of being able to have some kind of trust. Um, I haven't talked about this a ton, but when I first um, realized I was considering this path as a whistleblower, when I reached out to the people that eventually helped me, I was vetted. I was hardcore vetted for a number of months, really, before um, we really moved forward. And and I think it's in some ways a shame that we kind of, how do I describe this? I think our movement could have been built so much quicker or easier if we didn't have to operate like this, but we really do. We absolutely do. There's good historical precedent for why, um and this is just kind of the way I feel like we have to still operate moving forward. You will get canceled. You will. There's just so much at risk that, yeah, the Moscow rules really are the way we have to play the game.
You are one of the key witnesses who can testify to just how little safeguarding there was in these clinics. Even if questions are asked, they're not enough to be sure that no harm is done, because nobody can be sure that that particular child is actually going to follow through as an adult on this medicalization regimen, that they'll actually want to do that. And you can lock them into medicalization early and leave them with no choice.
I think one of the biggest problems with gender medicine begins with the concepts around consent and what you're consenting to. You cannot have a true ethical consent in any way unless you start with a diagnosis. And that includes the parents have to understand what the diagnosis is, and the patient has to understand what the diagnosis is. I don't believe in gender medicine there is a real diagnosis being provided. So, what we have is essentially a mental health condition that is being treated with a physical health protocol that leads to the harm of the body. And so, we start with the lack of consent because these kids do not know what their diagnosis is because they are self-diagnosing. And what would happen in these clinical rooms is that basically the clinician and the parent would be turning to the kid and saying, "Are you really trans?" And the kid was basically the one um, making the full diagnosis, and and that's just not how medicine works. Everybody had given up their responsibility. The doctor was no longer responsible. The parents would turn to the kid and basically say, you have to be really sure about this. And it all just led back to the child. And children just can't do that. They can't consent to things that they don't understand. They don't understand their loss of their fertility. They don't understand even what the concept of long term is. Um, so essentially, I don't think anyone can truly provide an ethical consent for any of these interventions.
When you went public, the Attorney General of Missouri, Andrew Bailey, said in a filing that you had, quote, provided documentary evidence that the center has been unlawfully billing state taxpayers to fund these actions. Bailey has had a long fight with Planned Parenthood to access records as well. And while we think of Missouri as a red state, what was going on there? What is happening with Planned Parenthood and the center that made it an especially good way to defraud taxpayers, parents, insurers, etc.?
Yeah, so the Pediatric Gender Center at WashU had a really interesting relationship with the local Planned Parenthood. Um, just a sidebar, one of my first jobs out of undergrad, I was the clinical manager of the Planned Parenthood of North Central Florida for close to, I think, 5 years. Um, it the care model of Planned Parenthood has changed so much. It's gone also completely sideways regarding trans. But the OBGYN that had previously worked at WashU took the role of basically the clinic lead for, I think, most of the whole region, so the Planned Parenthood St. Louis region. When she left WashU, we all knew her. We stayed kind of in contact with her. And at a certain point, the our clinic was hitting kind of a couple brick walls. So we did not have that many safeguards in place, but there were a few that we still stuck to. One of those was that when a child comes to St. Louis Children's Hospital, the front desk is at least verifying one of the adults that is bringing the child. And that adult has to sign off that they're providing, hey, I brought this kid here. Often this is around insurance. So the parent is showing the insurance cards, often, has to hand over an ID, and then they sign that you can bill the insurance. So, what we knew that Planned Parenthood was not doing was that Planned Parenthood essentially at their front desk level was saying, if any adult brings a kid in, they're not going to go through all those steps. They're often self-pay, or they're often billing, state Medicaid. And so we knew this kind of loophole existed where, particularly when the kid turned 16, so Planned Parenthood was giving kids in the St. Louis region at 16 testosterone or feminizing hormones, really as loose. It was basically self-consent. As we would at 18. And so oftentimes we would have patients who we knew one of the biological parents was not willing to consent. And so oftentimes, as soon as that kid turns 16, we would tell the affirmative parent, hey, you don't have to, wait until 18. You would have to wait until 18 with us, but you could go over to Planned Parenthood at 16. And so there were a number of cases that we were openly, there's some emails even showing we had a couple Zoom meetings with the heads of that Planned Parenthood. That's the kind of documentation and information I was able to provide that showed we were talking about this, that we knew Planned Parenthood's rules, and we were getting around our own rules by intentionally referring kids over to Planned Parenthood. Um, what we learn later, or what I learned later from the local Planned Parenthood that I think Jennifer Block has done a really good job documenting, is that the Planned Parenthoods nationwide are essentially operating with little to no guardrails at all. If a person comes in and wants to be medically transitioned, they give them a 1 or 2 page document that they sign, and that's that. They don't do any mental health screenings. They don't require anything like that. I think Planned Parenthood, like Plume and Folk, have become, you know, a few of these pathways where young people at 18, 19, 20, 21 can essentially just get hormones on their own on a whim. And I think that's part of what has so many parents really fearful for their young people as soon as they turn 18.
This has, of course, impacted your family. I'm sure that between all these upheavals and pressures and worries, this has been very difficult. So, how is your family?
I do have 5 boys. I have 2 biological children. My 2 oldest, and then we had adopted the 3 youngest out of foster care. Um, the whistleblow itself had a huge impact on my relationship with my former spouse, um, Roxanne. Um, she remained trans-identified, I think, for up about 2 years after the whistleblow occurred. But one of the things that I always was thinking about as I was becoming a whistleblower was I had also seen her trajectory over time, and it was not one of health. Taking high doses of wrong sex hormones does not put the body into a state of health for anyone. And I saw that in my own home. Testosterone was not making her physically well. Um, she did end up detransitioning. Um, it's interesting to me in some ways, I had nothing to do with it. We had come to kind of just a point where we couldn't talk about it. Because it would just end in frustration. We couldn't talk about trans really at all. I actually think she had started listening to some other podcasts, and I think she had heard Ben Ryan talk on a podcast, and I think that was part of what piqued her in some ways. Um, we are no longer together. She lives close by. I think that we have a really good, strong co-parenting relationship. One of the more challenging elements that I don't think gets a lot of attention is um, what transition does to kids and how you can walk that back with kids. So we are still navigating what do the younger kids call her? Um, and we're trying to navigate that with as much grace and also with as much solid evidence that we can. There's just not a lot out there to understand how to do this best with little kids. And I wish that I wish that there was more, and I wish that these were the kind of things people thought more about before we not only started transitioning kids, but before we embraced transition kind of as a society. I don't think we thought through this experiment very well in multiple ways, including for families and children.
There has been a lot of fear mongering for so long. Years of suicide extortion have the effect of creating terror in families who've begun a medicalization path. And now these clinics are shutting down. So we see these stories with parents freaking out. What will happen to their baby, right? So you've been out there, you've been out in front, you've been saying that it will be fine. You taper them off the drugs, let them go through puberty. It will all work out. And the LGBT Courage Coalition has been out there too. What is your message to the parents who've been lied to all this time? What do you want them to know?
I cannot imagine being a parent in that scenario. Part of this is I think parents need to go back to being the adult in the room. And so that does mean that they need to lead, and there are ways for them to lead with evidence that we can help them with, but they have to be open to that consideration. What we really try to get people to understand is that stopping this pathway is possible. It's much more challenging the longer that you've been on any sort of hormone regimen. So primarily right now, I'm not talking about, say, a woman who's in her 40s who's been on testosterone for the past 15 years. That's not who I'm talking about. Right now, what I think we need to address for the kids in these centers is you'll have a cohort of kids who have been socially transitioned and not medically touched at all. That is a psychological stepping back and pathway out that we do have good precedents. We do have good guideposts. There is an amazing older but amazing old trigonometry episode with a parent by the name of Rose. She also wrote a Pitts article about this, about walking her young boys back out who had been socially transitioned. For those who've been put on a puberty blocker, puberty blockers are not a taper drug. It's either in or out. So if it's an implant, we remove the implant. If it's the injectable that's given every 3, 6 kind of months, you just don't get the next injection. And for the most part, puberty will restart. It can take very different lengths of time depending on how long someone's been in a puberty blocker. There's also a couple really small issues with puberty blockers. If you've had one in for a very long time, beyond the normal length of time that implant should be in, there are issues. You need to get it removed safely. They can break, they can migrate. There's some issues there. But for the most part, these kids have the ability to walk out of that pathway into their 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 natal puberty and be able to move forward. It's the kids that were then puberty blocked and put on cross-sex hormones that the taper is not medically necessary. Um, you can just cold turkey coming off these hormones, but the the physical withdrawal, it's not a medical crisis, but it's not comfortable. If you've been on testosterone a long time, it's a lot more comfortable to taper this off, slowly reducing your dose. People experience headaches, nausea, change of appetite, change of sleep, even things like they sweat less or more as they're coming off some of these drugs. Um, there are a number of irreversible changes that these kids are gonna need to be walked through, but it's possible. This is a possible pathway to come off. One of the things that is actually like really frustrating me with these centers who are claiming that they're quote closing. They are not being transparent to the public. They are not telling the public if they're still going to provide affirmative only therapeutic models where they basically tell these kids, oh, sorry, you can't get this anymore, but it's the bad, mean Trump's fault, and it's the day you turn 18, we're gonna, restart you. I don't think that is clinically the ethical way to do this. And then the other thing that these centers should step up to do that I have not seen out of a single closing center is they should guarantee to these kids and families that they will do ongoing bone density scans if you've been blocked to see how your bone density is returning. They should be still seen long term for any, you know, endocrine issues that might still occur. A lot of kids who've been put on things like testosterone for periods of time will have had blood chemistry changes. Their red blood cells will go up, their cholesterol will change. Um, they could be pre-diabetic. There's issues that they still need to be cared for and treated. And then the other thing I think that all of these kids that have ever been medicalized deserve is I think that they should be given fertility counseling and consideration long term by any hospital that's ever treated them. Um, so what I think we're seeing is we're seeing centers um, quitting in some ways, but not in any ethical way. They're not doing so recognizing any of the long-term harms or impacts. And I really think we need to be so careful because the minute that this administration changes, I would not be surprised, A, if a number of these programs potentially restart, and B, right now, a lot of these clinicians can simply move what they're doing from the hospital setting into their own private practice. So I'm just very skeptical of what is truly happening. And I will applaud the day one of these hospitals puts out some sort of ethical um, acknowledgement that they're going to care for these kids in the long term.
Shocked. I am shocked to learn that clinics and hospitals that displayed no ethics at any
I
point
know.
before now
I
are
know.
being unethical.
I I just I always have this belief that people can do better. And I hope that they would do better.
You were in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago. I saw you there. And then you were at the Endocrine Society in San Francisco, and I made it,
I think we just
but you
missed each
had
other.
just left. We,
Yes.
we barely missed each other.
Yes.
So, what was your takeaway from those events? Do you get any sense that the message is getting through? And now that the FTC is on the case, has your message changed any?
The FTC event I thought was really impactful and incredibly important. So there were a few elements to it that really stuck out for me. So one was that it was so professional, so um, respectful and compassionate. I So many of the young people that spoke, I am very grateful to the FTC just for listening and for giving them a chance to be heard in a setting like that. They have deserved that for a really long time. Other elements of that day that stick out, we always hear when we go to events like this, oh, that there's a protest planned or that we might have to walk through a bunch of angry kind of mobs. There was nothing like that. Nobody showed up. Nobody was there doing that at all. There was a single truck outside that had some very bizarre kind of message that wasn't even completely on point. Um, so in some ways, I found it to be incredibly impactful. The other thing that stuck out to me is that we truly are creating a very good brain trust for a movement. Um, there are some really smart people who are working on this, who were often in the audience there, but there's a lot of intelligence and thoughtfulness and a lot of vast representations across a lot of different fields too, that are working on this. So law, political science, the medical sciences, the sociology. I mean, we just have I just feel like we're in really good company when events like that occur. And then yes, I immediately flew from Central Time to Eastern Time to Pacific Time, and went out to the Endocrine Society conference. Um, Again, that also was really impactful to me. The first time we went to an Endocrine Society conference, there were four of us with homemade signs that we had made the night before. This time, in different waves, there were maybe 20 at different times. A lot of good representation. And the first time we went to the Endocrine Society conference, I think we printed out 500 pamphlets. Nobody wanted them at all. This time I had to go halfway through the first day to a print shop to get another 500 made because people were really willing to take our written material, which is a huge shift. Um, and And I just think when you're on the ground like that and you have those conversations with the clinicians and you see kind of the general groups, whether it's the Endocrine Society or the AAP, you see that the vast majority of the clinicians in these fields do not agree with this. And really, I wish there were better ways in these trade organizations that they could be a little bit more transparent and open about why they're still supporting this from a top-down level.
If I might ask, what has been your personal political journey? You don't have to give us a whole narrative of your political life, but for the record, I would like to know where you are now versus where you were, say, 5 years ago. What has that journey been like?
um, I'm still, I don't know the best word for it. There's still some element where I think I'm just kind of your old-fashioned kind of working class Democrat at heart. Um, there are so many other political ways where I still hold a lot of those values. But it really has been a journey. But one of the things that I find I'm smiling right now thinking about is I actually just think that um, people in this country, regardless of political party, are actually a lot um, saner and compassionate and kinder than I was led to believe. So I definitely think that my bubble of that kind of progressive Democrat was very much burst open um, after becoming a whistleblower. But the thing that I've come to embrace now is that I was living in a bubble that really painted these other political um, groups as something that they're not, which is that I don't, I have not met any elected official who's a Republican that has been unkind to me or has not fully embraced me, even though I am always clear when I meet anyone, that I say I'm still a Democrat and also that I'm an out lesbian. Um, it's just been overwhelming that I had limited my worldview so much because of what I thought the progressive politic was. And I just find my life so much richer now that I know people in really real ways from all across the political spectrum in this country. And I just think we have an amazing, amazing group of people here. And I'm really proud to um, be able to use words like bipartisan because it's true. My bubble is now turned into this giant bucket, and it's bipartisan and sloppy, and it leads to some of these amazing conversations with libertarians and hardcore conservatives. And yet, when you get out of that mindset that anybody who votes differently from you is evil, all you find is a richness.
Suppose we win tomorrow. The gender dragon that eats children is vanquished. There will never be another Jazz Jennings. What will you do next? Will you write a book and then go plant a garden, or do you have some second act in mind?
The first thing we have to define is what a win looks like. And a win to me is that medicalization is not promoted for anyone at any age, that there is no self-identification, that our legal documents are based on your sex and that cannot be changed. Medicalization has always been my core issue, but the peripheral issues like prisons and sports, if the dragon is slain across all of these elements, then yes, I think you've actually nailed it. What I would love to move on to do, which I have talked to a little bit about on Twitter, I love gardening. I love growing my own food. I love things like sustainability and permaculture. I think the 5 and 10 year plan right now is the hope to secure a decent amount of acreage because one of the things I want to see is that when the dragon is slain, there's going to be so many people who will have impacts from this for the next 30 years. And so, we hope to create a place where parents who were impacted can come for a retreat space. Young people who are being walked out of this medically can come and learn skills, learn building skills, learn permaculture skills, go on hikes. campfires, connect with nature. Trans was able to get a foothold because other elements of our society had been broken. And a lot of that has to do with the parent-child relationships and has to do, I think, with our use and misuse of technologies. And so part of what I think, Act Two will be about is continuing to work with people who were harmed by this in a way to reconnect with the physical body and the natural world, and promote healing in those ways. And yes, I just want to grow copious amounts of tomatoes and play around with making canning things for the winter and learning how to live sustainably.
I've seen you hanging out with the LGBT Courage Coalition, so tell the listeners where they can find you and support your work.
Yeah, we have had so much growth in the past year. So what we finally have is a gorgeous website that I'm really proud that we've put together in the last 6 months. It's lgbcouragecoalition.org. We have a contact page, we have a donation page, contact. You can fill it out. We will mail you sticker packs if you want to go sticker in your cities. We have been running a Substack since our inception, and I'm really proud of the work that our volunteers do there. We have built up a true volunteer base. Also, in the next month, we're going to be rolling out a monthly lecture series for paid subscribers to our Substack. And we have now managed to get a volunteer to we're building videos. We're on all of the major social media sites as well. So you can pretty much hopefully find us anywhere you go to look, even on Blue Sky, but I think we have like 6 followers over there. Somehow we haven't been banned.
There's also a podcast that you're part of, isn't there?
Yes. That's not directly LGBT Courage Coalition. It is called Informed Dissent, and it is honestly a group of friends. So it's myself, Lisa Selim Davis, Ben Appel, Corey Cohn, and Sarah Mittemeyer, who used to be known under her pen name Eliza Montegreen. And we record pretty much every week. We took off last week and this week, but we have, I think, 36 episodes out already.
Jamie Reed. I never use this word because it is so overused and abused, but you are a hero to me. Thank you for coming on the show today, and thank you for blowing this whistle.
Thank you so much, Matt, for having me. And you asked really good questions. Good job.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the full podcast. The Distance is an encampment for everyone made politically homeless by gender ideology. Visit our website at www.thedistancemag.com to support our work with a monthly or annual premium subscription.